My name is Alphonso David, and I am the president of the Human Rights Campaign, which is the largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer civil rights organization in the nation and around the globe. I'm also the first person of color and the first civil rights lawyer to lead the organization. Thank you all for joining us this evening for a timely conversation with celebrated poet Jericho Brown to discuss the complexities of the human experience and how poetry can challenge us and better inform our lives. Jericho Brown is a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and the director of the Creative Writing Program and a professor at Emory University. Jericho is author of The Tradition, which he won the Pulitzer Prize for. He is the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Jericho's first book, Please, won the American Book Award. His second book, The New Testament, won the Annensfield Wolf Book Award. And his most recent collection, The Tradition, was incredibly well received, winning both the Pulitzer Prize and the Patterson Poetry Prize, as well as being listed as a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. His poems are urgent, piercing, and multi-dimensional. They force us to confront the challenges and the obstacles of our personal experiences, even when we want to ignore those obstacles or didn't realize they were there. His poems continue to speak to you long after you have put down his books. Jericho's work has appeared in the Bennington Review, BuzzFeed, Fence, Jubilee, The New Republic, The New York Times, The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Time Magazine, and several volumes of the best American poetry. Jericho, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I need you to go everywhere I ever go. I really appreciate you asking me to be here, though. Seriously, it's really an honor, and it gives me a chance to put an actual shirt on and throw some hair dye in my beard. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. We are very excited to have you tonight. We would be honored to hear you read some of your poems. But before we do that, I want to start with a few questions. I want to start at the core. Start this conversation at the core of what drives you. What drew you to poetry? Of all of the options that you have in life, why poetry?
It's interesting. I grew up at a time where children were still considered beings that were worthy of being seen and not heard. And my mom and dad meant that. They weren't just joking about it. So I had a lot to say in a world where I wasn't supposed to be heard. There was a lot going on that I wanted to respond to. And because of that, I found that I could write down the things that I had to say and nobody would bother me about writing them down. As a matter of fact, when people would see me when I was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old in a corner with a notebook writing, they would only comment, "Oh, he must be smart." So I had this kind of approval from adults because I was writing, and they never bothered to look at anything that I was writing about, which meant that I could be saying very awful things about them. And they would still think I was smart. So it all worked out that I had this option of doing something I enjoyed doing, just expression. But then I think that got mixed into, expression is one thing, but poetry isn't really about expression. It's about the perfection of expression. And so I think the other two things that were really important, one is that I grew up in the Black church. And at the time, I'm not sure if it's this way now, but at the time, young people really weren't allowed to be shy. No matter how old you were, when a holiday came around, and there seemed a holiday every 2 weeks, you were trotted onto the front of the sanctuary. And in the front of the sanctuary, you would have to recite, you would have to say Happy Easter or Jesus wept if you were really very young. But as soon as you had more language to you, you would have to recite entire chapters, the 23rd Psalm, and right along with all of those pageants and plays and speeches, there would always be the requirement of reading and reciting poetry. So right next to hearing a 10-year-old recite the 23rd Psalm, you would hear someone else reciting Still I Rise by Maya Angelou, or Ego Trippin' by Nikki Giovanni, or Mother to Son, or The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. So it was a part of my life that went right along with seeing this very plain spoken dignity. You know, when Black people stand up in church, they suddenly speak with a certain kind of dignity that they may not have been speaking with otherwise. I remember watching our pastor recently died of complications related to COVID-19. But I remember thinking that what he was doing was, with every word, making emotional reaction that I could see. And I remember admiring that and wanting that kind of what seemed to me magic power. That, and growing up in the church and spending a lot of time in libraries when I was a kid and coming across poems and being excited about them because they were short. You know, I would open a book of prose and there were so many words and I was like 9. I'm like, I can't read all of that. And I would look at a book of poetry and it would be 1/4 of the page. And I was like, oh, I got this under control. So I remember the first time I read a book of poetry. I don't remember the book. What I remember is my mother's reaction. We got back in the car with her. She's an improvisational genius, by the way. So she understood that when she needed to run an errand where she couldn't have rambunctious kids with her, she would take us to the library. And the librarians, whether they knew it or not, were our babysitters, you know. And I remember getting in the car one day and she said to us, as she always would, "What'd you do in the library today?" And I said, "Mommy, I read a book." And my mother gave this look of absolute delight. And I remember it was as if she was singing, "My baby read a book." And I wanted to make that happen as often as I could. So I would go in the library and I thought maybe I was cheating because, you know, books of poetry were shorter and the poems were shorter. And I would read books of poetry. And I think seeing language perfected in that way made me want to do it for other people.
Interesting. I want to talk both about family and religion and faith. Let's start with religion and faith, which, as you know, is a cornerstone for many communities, including the Black community. Many find that they have to find their own God outside of traditional constructs. I grew up in the church as well. And I found myself disconnected from the deity who I was told would reject me. You have talked about a similar challenge. How do you find poetry? How has poetry helped you find God to the extent it has? And how are you using it to challenge others who believe in a God that may summarily reject you based on identity?
Yeah. I would say that when I think about God, I think it's of use. It's of use for me to think about source, and it's of use for me to think about a creator, which means that God for me turns out to be someone with the power to make an entire world, right? And push a button and it goes. That world seems to be going on its own. And I think what poems do for me, and not just in the writing of poetry, but also in the reading of poetry, I would go beyond that. I would say a real appreciation for all art has to do with existing in what I call the creative field. The creative field is very different from what we're told to exist in. We're usually told to exist in certain tracks. You know, you have your career track or your marriage track, or your, you know, we're all like, we're supposed to be on these tracks of assimilation, which lead to supposed success or happiness. But the creative field, on the other hand, has to do with you deciding, I think you deciding for yourself what you want your life to look like. When I read poems, I'm still amazed by this. I'm amazed that when I read, and I think this happens whenever you view art, whenever you consume art, but when I read a poem, what I am doing is holding in my hands a piece of paper. And on that piece of paper are characters. I mean, just ink, right? Words, we call them. And somehow, in spite of the fact that I'm only looking at a piece of paper, in my mind, I see things, I see actions, I see characters making moves. I think that is amazing in and of itself. And I find that to be, I think that's like sorcery, or something, right? Beyond that, not only do I see those things, but I interact with them enough that I begin to feel moved, that I cry, or that I laugh, or that I have a different understanding of intimacy. And I have found that if I think about God as a creator, then I understand that that God has also imbued me with a power to create. And in the same way that I make poems, I can make other parts of my life. So I think what we learn from reading is that we learn we have an active imagination. And as soon as we learn that we have an active imagination, we can take that active imagination to other parts of our lives. And if we can do that, we can then write those other parts of our lives. And by that right, I mean R-I-G-H-T, right? We can look, you know, when you read a poem, and I got this email, I'll never forget it, after my first book came out. I got this email from this Presbyterian minister who said that reading my book made him rethink the way he was being a father to his son, right? So there's something about the imagination that I put in my book, writing about my father. My first book in many ways is about my dad, that made him think about who he was as a dad, that made him think about who he had been as a son, made him think about what his son was probably experiencing. So if we can live in the imaginative and in the creative field, then that doesn't just stick with the poem, that doesn't just stick with the book. It will lead to how you love your brother, how you love your lover, how you deal with things that you deal with. And because there may not be examples for that, for us in particular, this long list of names, you know, that we go by in terms of our identity, right? There might not be examples we see of that, but if the imagination, if the creative field is stimulated, we might not need the examples, we can make it up. And I'm interested in improvisation much more than I am in assimilation. Does that answer you?
That does answer the question. And as you talk about improvisation as opposed to assimilation, we should talk about identity as it relates to race.
Yeah.
So we're both Black gay men living in the United States. And as such, I think it's fair to say that we have an unfortunate and unique cultural relationship to mortality that is confounding, infuriating, and sometimes mind-numbing. So a young man in Georgia, as you know, Ahmaud Arbery, was killed a few months ago, and a video was released recently showing that Ahmaud was killed by two white men on the street. The assailants were not arrested, they were not charged until last week, under intense public pressure, once again raising, for many people, deep concerns about living while Black in the United States. In your writings, you have explored identity, you have explored male Blackness and mortality. How do you personally confront your mortality as a Black man? And is it reflected differently on the page, if at all? As you think about identity and how you reflect it for yourself and how you reflect it in your poetry.
Well, I think to answer this question, I'll just have to say that I used to think that the trouble was prejudice or racism, that there was this understanding on the part of people who I am not, that when they look at me, they didn't like me because I was Black. And it was only recently that I realized that the trouble was much deeper than that. And by recently, I mean within the last, I would say 8 years. When I first moved into the house where I live, one of the wonderful things about it is I got an opportunity to do something I never thought I would do. I started turning into my father. And turning into my father meant that I was spending a lot of time in the yard. And I was working on a flower bed in front of, I was doing the very thing I said when I left my parents' house I would never do again. I was working on a flower bed in front of my front porch. And I'd never lived in a neighborhood like this before. I live in a neighborhood where when I moved in, people quite literally came by my house with casseroles. I didn't think it was possible. I also didn't know that so many raisins could be in so many casseroles. So people would come to the house with their casseroles and they would say nice things. And I would be confused, like, what do y'all want? But I thought it was really nice, you know. And one of my neighbors, she walked just right past me while I was working on the flower bed, and she rang the doorbell. I thought it was so weird. And I looked up and I said, "Hi, excuse me." And she looked down where I was kneeling in the flower bed, and she said, "Oh, hi, I'm just looking for the man or the woman of the house." And I said, it's me, it's the man or the woman, you know? And I remember, I mean, sort of as an addendum to this story, the look on her face was a look of embarrassment because she understood that she had made a kind of a mistake, a faux pas. And I understood that my job as a Black person in that moment was to save her from her faux pas, which we so often do, right? So I dove in and I just start talking really quickly because I was like, oh, she didn't understand. You know, I sort of realized it at the same time that she realized it, you know, what was happening. And in that moment, I realized that the problem that she was having is that though she could imagine me taking care of those flowers, she couldn't imagine that they were mine. She couldn't imagine that the investment that I had in that kind of beauty would be something that came from something that was mine, and that the investment was beyond work, but also toward work that led to beauty. You know, just, I want my yard to be pretty. And my dad used to say, "Ooh, that's a pretty yard." And I think that part of what we deal with in terms of violence is the fact that when people look at us, they don't actually see people, they see animals. And that hurts. And so then the question is, I think you're asking me is, how do I get beyond that hurt? And yes, it's true that maybe my writing allows for that. It allows for me to organize my thought about that. But the real 100, and especially in this book, I mean, this book really began that day when my neighbor saw me. That's why this book has so many flowers and trees and rabbits in it. It's really just made up of what I see in my front yard. But what I realized when Mike Brown's body lay in the street for all the hours that it lay there, I realized that the grief I was experiencing watching the news was a national Black grief. I mean, around the world, Black grief. And the thing I remember is that I was watching this on television. I was getting text messages about it from other people who were watching it on television, phone calls. And as I was watching this happen, the community there in Ferguson were all barricaded off, and they were also, all these Black people were watching just this body just lying in the street. And somebody did what at that moment was an illegal thing. He went beyond the barricade that he was not supposed to go beyond, and he covered Mike Brown's body. And I think at that moment, I realized that the only way I've been able to get through or deal with any of this is understanding that my grief is not only my grief, it is a community grief. And that though I do not have the power to end what causes this grief, I do have brothers and sisters who stand with me understanding that, that what we experience as it relates to that level of terror is something that we can see in one another's eyes. The next day when I went to work, I remember looking at Black people, and I remember Black people looking at me. And I remember feeling like we were there for one another in a way that nobody else could be without saying a word. So I wish I had more of an answer that comes directly from poetry. And maybe I do, because I know when I write from an ancestry. I know I write with people in mind and with people thinking about me who I don't even know they are sending good energy my way. But when I wrote the poems in this book that reference police violence in the way that they do, I can't say that any of those poems solve those problems. I can say that can hope that they go in the world and they add to the community of grief, and that they help us live on through those problems. I mean, I'm amazed at the fact that we thrive in the midst of all of this mess. I mean, and that's what I really honestly try to focus on and think about. And we still rise. And we still rise. Yeah. I have one additional question for you before you read. You have said that poetry is infused with doubt. Yeah. Specifically, you talked about line breaks, forcing us to confront fear. When you're reading a poem and there's a line break, you sometimes gasp. And you've said that readers of poetry must embrace fear. We're all living through a lot of fear and uncertainty right now with COVID-19. How can, from your perspective, how can poetry and the structure of poetry help us tackle fear
the unknown, the crisis that we're grappling with right now?
Yeah, what you're referring to is the fact that I have said, and one of the ways that I talk about line and line break with my students is that the unit of poetry is indeed the line, that though it might not be the end of a sentence, we feel that we have gotten the entirety of a story in the fact of one line in a poem. And that's sort of my goal. That's what I'm aiming for when I write my lines. And so when I get to the end of a line, I get to the end of a line in a poem and I see that there are more lines beyond me, I feel like I just got an entire story. So how could there be more? And that is, I think, for a reader, the scariest thing in the world. Particularly if there's a line break that's in jams. You get to the end of a line, there's no period, there's no question mark, and you're supposed to know there's just, and for that millisecond, I believe this as a reader, for that millisecond, you're like, oh my God, what is going to happen? You know, so there's this, it's like if you really enjoy movies in the genre that they call suspense, it's like you have to deal with suspense over and over again until you get to the last line of a poem. And that's part of what I love about poetry, that it reminds me that in life, there will be doubts, there will be fears, but that I always land in faith, right? All you got to do is move your head, move your eyes to the beginning of that line and go again. You're going to hit some doubt, but you go again to the beginning of that line until you reach the last line of the poem. And upon reaching the last line of the poem, hopefully all of that doubt that you sort of internalized while reading it line by line, hopefully that doubt becomes worth it because of the payoff at the end of the poem, because of having read the whole poem, because of having lived the whole life of the poem. I believe that all is well. And it's hard believing that, you know, as a Black queer person on this planet, but I believe that all is well. And I have to believe that when I see horrific things, that they are temporary, though they repeat themselves, that in that moment they are temporary. And so that's one way that I think about faith, that, you know, in the grand scheme of things, there is faith and there is joy, even if I've got to look for it, even if I have to make a habit of finding it, even if I have to, as I do, write down the thing I'm grateful for in the morning and right before I go to bed at night. But if I can keep my mind on that, then I can see more of that. And that helps me when I'm dealing with the doubt, when I'm dealing with fear, and when I'm dealing with terror. If we can indeed remember what we're grateful for, that puts us, it's like it puts armor on us to fight the fight that we have to fight to live every day, if that makes sense.
It does. And when you said that, I automatically thought about All Is Well With My Soul, which is a song that many people who are Christian will remember or know, that is often sang at funerals. When people sort of talk about you are going from one dimension to the next dimension and recognizing that you lived in such a way that your soul is safe as you transition to the next sphere. And when you said all is well, I automatically went to that song. Yeah, which is beautiful. So with that, I would love if you would honor us with a few readings. Of course, your choice, whatever you think is appropriate.
I'll read 3 poems. And then if there's time, I'll read more. Okay?
Okay.
Good?
And you're going to tell us which ones you're reading.
Yeah, I'll tell you which ones I'm reading. I'm going to start with a poem called 4 Day in the Morning. 4 day in the morning is a phrase that I'm not sure. I know in Louisiana, I would always hear older people say 4 day in the morning. And I think what the phrase means will become clear as I read the poem. It's very much a Mother's Day poem, and we're coming out of Mother's Day, so I've been thinking about it a lot. 4 day in the morning. My mother grew morning glories that spilled onto the walkway toward her porch. because she was a woman with land who showed as much by giving it color. She told me I could have whatever I worked for. That means she was an American, but she'd say it was because she believed in God. I am ashamed of America and confounded by God. I thank God for my citizenship in spite of the timer set on my life to write these words. I love my mother. I love Black women who plant flowers as sheepish as their sons. By the time the blooms unfurl themselves for a few hours of light, the women who tend them are already at work. Blue. I'll never know who started the lie that we are lazy, but I'd love to wake that bastard up at 4 in the morning, toss him in a truck, and drive him under God past every bus stop in America to see all those Black folk waiting to go work for whatever they want. A house, a boy to keep the lawn cut, some color in the yard. My God, we leave things green. I should say about that poem, that poem has a sentence, and it's my favorite sentence I've ever put in a poem. It's, I love my mother. And it was, I had written that sentence and it sat around in a notebook for a little while. And I said, well, that's something you'll never be able to say in a poem because it's completely cliche, precious, and sentimental. And yet here comes the poem where I finally found a place to use it. I'm always grateful for that. This next poem I wrote after finding out about and being confounded by the very long list of people who have supposedly committed suicide while in police custody. That includes folks like Sandra Bland in Texas, who many of us are so familiar with. You know, Sandra Bland supposedly hung herself with a trash bag, but she did so in a cell where there was video footage, you know, streaming footage of her. And for whatever reason, we are told that that footage goes out. There's technical difficulty at just the moment that the coroner says she hung herself with a trash bag. It's also a poem that remembers Jesus Huerta in North Carolina, who on the walk from the police cruiser to the building where he was to be booked, while handcuffed and after having been patted down, somehow managed to shoot himself in the back corner of his head. Or Victor White III in Louisiana, where I'm from, who, after having been patted down while handcuffed, sitting in the backseat of a police cruiser, somehow managed supposedly to shoot himself in the upper back. It's a poem called Bullet Points. Bullet points. I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed or in the jail cell of a town I only know the name of because I have to drive through it to get home. Yes, I may be at risk, but I promise you, I trust the maggots who live beneath the floorboards of my house to do what they must to any carcass more than I trust an officer of the law of the land to shut my eyes like a man of God might, or to cover me with a sheet so clean my mother could have used it to tuck me in. When I kill me, I will do it the same way most Americans do. I promise you, cigarette smoke, or a piece of meat on which I choke, or so broke I freeze in one of these winters we keep calling worst. I promise if you hear of me dead anywhere near a cop, then that cop killed me. He took me from us and left my body, which is, no matter what we've been taught, greater than the settlement a city can pay a mother to stop crying, and more beautiful than the new bullet fished from the folds of my brain. I'll end with a poem that really comes out of, I'll read another poem. It really comes out of my influences. Whenever I think about this particular poem, all of my poems in a way, but this particular poem, I see two things coming through in a way that really makes me happy and proud for my own work and having written the poem. One is that Maya Angelou used to always say that every poem is a love poem. And Sonia Sanchez always says every poem is a political poem. And I believe everything Maya Angelou and Sonia Sanchez, anything they say, I believe it, right? Because I got good sense. So, so that both of these things have to be true, that every poem is a love poem and every poem is a political poem, which also means that every poem has to indeed carry all of us, both light and joy, within each poem. So this is a poem, you know, I love poetry. I hope it's clear. I love poetry more than anything.
Oh, it's clear.
I know it's funny. It's actually kind of funny because I'm so glad to be having this conversation with you and having so many conversations lately, because I actually feel equipped to have them. It's like, wow, people just want to talk to me about poetry. I know all about that. So I'm very happy. I'm very happy. I'm very happy to be having these conversations. But the only thing I love more than, there's only one thing I love more than poetry, and that's cuddling. So this is a poem about cuddling. Stand. Peace on this planet, or guns glowing hot. We lay there together as if we were getting something done. It felt like planting a garden or planning a meal for a people who still need feeding. All that touching or barely touching, not saying much, not adding anything. The cushion of it, the skin, and occasional sigh. All seemed like work worth mastering. I'm sure somebody died while we made love. Somebody killed, somebody black. I thought then of holding you as a political act. I may as well have held myself. We didn't stand for one thought, didn't do a damn thing. And though you left me, I'm glad we didn't. So those are some poems.
Wow.
Thank you. Thank you, Alphonso.
Wow. Okay. Well, we also have, as you know, we asked audience members to submit questions.
Hi, Jericho and Alphonso. My name is Madeline. Thank you both so much for being here. I just wanted to ask, Jericho, could you tell us a little bit about what your writing process usually looks like when you kind of sit down to think about and start writing a new poem? Thank you so much.
It's sort of a difficult question to answer because I feel like I'm writing all day. You know, when you're a poet by identity. And so you begin to understand that every image and every conversation is sort of, if it's not being used in that very moment, it's going to get used, right? So I'm sort of paying a different kind of attention to the world and to the language that comes to me as I'm moving around in the world. But as a practice, what I do, or at least what I'm supposed to do, when things are good, what I'm doing daily is I wake up in the morning and I do 100 burpees. Well, right now I can't seem to get past 82 burpees, but I wake up.
Wait, 100 burpees?
Yeah, well, 82. So I had some health issues and I had to come back to my burpees. So I haven't gotten back to 100, but I'm working. I was in the 70s for a while. Now I'm back in the 80s, you know. I mean, if you're trying to have a burpee competition with me, I feel like.
Well, we can actually talk about that in another conversation. But
oh, okay.
Yeah,
we can talk.
I work out every day as well. So.
But look, I mean, but how many burpees?
That is part 2.
I mean, but how many burpees you got though? Anyway, so for real, I'm sorry, I apologize. Edit that out. Anyway, so I do 100 burpees, then I eat, and then I sit down to write. Part of me doing those 100 burpees first, other than the fact that I like to be able to be fine all the time, part of me doing those 100 burpees has to do with physical exercise, you know, going for a walk. I mean, something as simple as going for a walk, but physical exercise that is indeed very, that asks a lot of my body means I have to get out of my head, right? And if I'm out of breath, I'm not anxious, I'm not obsessive, I'm too busy trying to find my breath. So if I can get to a point where I'm out of breath and then turn to the writing, then I can see it new. And I think it's important that people know that writing for me, when I sit down to do work that I do daily, I do not expect to come away with a poem every day. I expect to get work done. And over a period of years, I might have enough poems. But my plan when I sit down is to fail. My plan is to push around lines that are already there often. This book is made up of, the oldest line in this book probably comes from 1999. I don't throw anything away. So when I get an idea, which I really actually don't work with ideas, I should say, when I get a line, I try to push forward from that line, or I try to juxtapose it with other lines that already exist somewhere on my computer. And I tinker and I push, and I do that for about 2 hours every day. And then I don't have a timer that says 2 hours. I know 2 hours have passed because I'm hungry again, and I'm usually hungry every 2 hours. And when I get hungry again, I stop and I say, well, I did what I was supposed to do today. And I have learned over time to trust that if I do that, if I practice that, then what was 2 hours will expand the closer I get to understanding what I'm really working on, and the closer I get to finishing a book. By the time I was working on this book, it was all I could do, to the point where I had a schedule of friends and their bedtimes. So I would know that my friends on the West Coast were still up. And if I wanted to send them a poem in the middle of the night, at 3 in the morning, my friends who stayed up late would still get it. Do you know what I mean? So, so it depends on where I am in a book. But generally, if I'm at the beginning of things, 2 hours a day, I think, does it.
When does the theme come? Do you decide at the outset that you're writing the tradition? Do you decide you're writing the New Testament? Or does that come after you've written a few poems where it shapes into a theme for you?
The theme in a book comes way after I've written all of the poems for the book. And a theme in a poem might not make itself known to me until I've been working on the poem for a very long time, because what I'm after when I write a poem has to do with an intuitive feeling that it is working, that it is right. And that intuitive feeling, I call it intuitive, but it's half intuitive and half training. I've read a lot of poems, so I know when something's on the mark. I know when something's new. The way to think about it is, I like to use Whitney Houston as an example, but I would like to, in this conversation, use Whitney Houston's song, Lover for Life, from that great album, her first album with Babyface, that album, I'm Your Baby Tonight, Lover for Life, which was never a single, but which is a great song. There's a lot of, she does a lot of melisma toward the end, a few runs, and it's very clear that she's doing it in order to perfect it. She's doing it because it sounds good. So for her, it's not a matter of, oh, here's an answer to a problem, right? Or here's how you will feel. It has to do with making her own internalized feeling about the song apparent through the sound she's making out of her mouth. And that's what I'm trying to do when I write a poem. I'm trying to make feelings apparent more than I am thinking thematically. And theme comes later, but I need to be as unaware of it as possible. If you start with an idea, you will write a bad poem. You'll write a great speech, you'll write a good essay, but you will write a bad poem, and you will only say what you set out to say. The difference between poetry and many other genres is that it is the genre, poetry is the genre of investigation and discovery. And when I'm writing, I'm finding out things because I'm meandering my way through language to figure things out. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, good, I'm glad. Sometimes I feel like I sound like some sort of a witch doctor.
No, that made a lot of sense. There's another question that came in about process.
Hi, Jericho. Krillius from Team Racine here. I have a question my question is, when you're in the process of writing, which one is more important to you? actually producing that art and putting it out there for people to consume? Or do you think more about the impact that your work will have on the intersecting communities that you speak about in your work?
Okay, so can we take these one by one? The first
Yeah,
one.
I know that was a compound question, so you can break that up.
Yeah. The first one is, do I think about producing art? No, I don't consciously think about producing art when I'm writing a poem. What I do think that might be more conscious than that is, when I'm revising, I am thinking about making poems I haven't seen before. You know, the Jericho Brown poem is not the Danez Smith or the Terrence Hayes or the Faylita Hicks. The Jericho Brown poem has to be the Jericho Brown poem, just like the Allen Ginsberg poem needs to be the Allen Ginsberg poem. In order for me to make that poem, what I am trying to do is contribute to myself first, and maybe to all of literature later, but I don't really think about it that way while I'm doing it. Contribute to myself and to my reading knowledge the poems I have yet to read but want to read. So when I write, I'm really just thinking, oh, why isn't there a poem that does this? Or why have I never read a poem in which these things happen? Or why haven't I read a poem where the metaphors work this way? Or why haven't I read a poem where the line works that way? Do you understand what I mean?
Yes.
And then I am trying to make that happen. And I always think it's good for people to know that everybody that we admire, this is exactly how they work, right? You know, the reason we have Homecoming is because Beyonce had never seen anything like it. And so she wanted to make some. She has the idea and she's like, oh, that's never happened. Why not? I should make it. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's how I think for my students, at least, I tell them, you know, if you want to be a teacher one day, think about what you would have wanted to see when you were being taught, right? If you want to be a writer, think about what you would have wanted to read when you were reading. So I think that's the only thing I think about. I guess I forgot to go. What was the second one? The
second one is, do you think more about the impact your work will have on the intersecting community that you speak about in your work?
No, I don't. And I have no, it's nice, but I have no expectation about it whatsoever. I'm always surprised, and I thank God for all of the poets who came before me, particularly the Black poets and the Black gay poets and the queer poets, period, who came before me to make this supposed success of mine, this recognition, often financial, to make that possible. That's only possible for me because it wasn't possible for other people who are great writers. So, you know, S.X. Hemphill was a great writer, but he could not have experienced the kind of what people might call mainstream success that is available to me. But the only reason that's available to me is because S.X. Hemphill was a writer.
Mm.
But
now, you've mentioned a few poets and writers who you like.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure you finish your point, and then I'll ask you about that. But I think you were finishing your point.
I was just saying that when I started writing, there had been 2 Black Pulitzer Prize winners in poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when I was seriously in school, there had been 2, and they were 36 or 37 years apart. So there was nothing in me expecting another one, let alone that it be me. I was doing this and still am doing this for Jericho Brown first because I love it. And I think it's important that I do what I love and that everybody else do too. So I don't really think about like saving people's lives. I'm happy to, but I don't have it in mind that I will be able to. Okay, sorry. Now you want to ask me about poets.
I want to ask you about poets because that's one of the questions we received.
Jericho and Alphonso. My name is Matilda, my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for holding this discussion. Jericho, besides yourself, who is another poet or writer that all of us should be reading? Thank you.
Everybody should be reading Lucille Clifton. She's probably my favorite poet, if I had to, and I think she's a great poet. And by that, what I mean is I think what Clifton managed over the course of her career is tantamount to the way we think about people like Dickinson and Whitman. She's amazing. And anyway, yeah, Lucille, I could talk, I'm a college professor, so I'm trying to rein it in. But and then, there are younger poets, contemporary poets I admire. Obviously, sometimes you feel bad about talking about people, but they're as good as their fame warrants. Hanif Abdurraqib, I love his writing in poetry and in prose. Dinesh Smith, I love his writing, and I think he's working on plays. He's a great poet. I mentioned Faylita Hicks before.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of poets. But naming poets gets really difficult because you just want to name them all. I read Milton. He's good. Do you understand? Like he's actually, the Paradise Lost is really good, man. It's particularly good if you're gay, but that's another story.
Well, speaking of that.
Hi, I am Leslie Hall, the director of the HBCU program at the Human Rights Campaign. Last week, Dr. Walter Kimbrough, the president of Dillard University, mentioned you in his remarks for our virtual LGBTQ graduation. He said how proud he was that you, a Black gay man, a Dillard graduate, was honored with a Pulitzer Prize. HRC's HBCU program has a 15-year history of working to create LGBTQ inclusive HBCUs. Can you reflect on how your experience at Dillard as a gay man has shaped you, and what words would you like to provide to other HBCU leaders who want to provide a safe space for students?
Wow. Wow. What a question. That's also two parts. Can you ask me just the first part?
Sure. The first part is, can you reflect on how your experience at Dillard as a gay man has shaped you?
Yeah, wow. So I went to Dillard. I don't know what is happening at the HBCUs right now because I'm not teaching at one and I'm not a student at one. I know they get my money every month because I believe in them. But I do know that when I went to college, and this would have been in the 90s, there weren't real life safe spaces for queer people. You had your friends, you had your friendships, and I definitely was not out in the way that I'm out now when I was in college, because it would not have been safe for me. And I wouldn't have been able to do the things that were most important to me at that time on that college campus. If I had been an out gay man, I wouldn't have been able to pledge the fraternity that I shared with Dr. Kimbrough. Do you know what I mean? So that kind of thing is new. While it is new, I think in terms of answering the question of how it shaped me, I began to understand better that would be something I would have to overcome, because everything at Dillard was about that. You hear about the civil rights, you hear about civil rights, you hear about freedom, you hear about creating your own life, you hear about doing the work you do for the social well-being of others, and you begin to wonder, well, how does that apply for me? Because I see how it's applying for y'all, but I know if y'all knew what was true about me, that wouldn't include me. And so what I realized that Dr. Cook, who was our president, Samuel Du Bois Cook, was passing to me, and so many of the teachers there were passing to me at that time, was a way of living that I would have to use in my own way, even though they were not prepared for the way I would use it. And I thank God for a world in which now they are probably prepared. I think Spelman does a lot better, Beverly Guy Sheftall being there for so long and being such a wise human being. And I imagine all of the Black schools, especially because of the work you're saying that the HRC is doing with them now, I imagine that they're all safer places for us and much more inclusive than what they were at that time. What was the second part of that question?
The second part of the question is, what words would you like to provide to other HBCU leaders who want to provide a safe space for students?
Well, one is that what's really important is that I think students be able to do their thing. And by their thing, I mean individually. You have to create a world. What I try to do in my classroom is I create a space where whatever it is that your inclination is, you are able to follow it and fail at it. And people really need the opportunity to go for what they want to go for and fail at doing it. And that's exactly what I think liberal arts institutions should be about. You know, one of the things that I ask my students early on is if they can cook. And then a few of them raise their hands. And then I say, no. I mean, who can really cook? I mean, who can cook so well that I'm gonna get them a ring? And, you know, there's usually one hand left. And I say, what can you cook? And that person will say, lasagna. And then I say, tell me what happened the first time you tried to cook lasagna. And every year they burn the doggone lasagna. And I'm saying that because whatever you do well, you didn't do well the first time you did it. Do you know what I mean? Anything you're good at doing, you're good at doing because somebody provided you the training ground to do it. And so you have to really actively figure out who are the students on my campus who may not have the stage, and how do I make the stage for them so that they have the training ground necessary to fail. By the time they're graduating, they're good at the thing that they failed at the entire time they were here. And if you fail enough, fail turns into play. And that's how work gets done. You feel like you're playing. And if you can start turning failure into play, then you can make things happen. So that's not very much of an on the ground answer, but I would like more time with that question, because I would like a better on the ground, day-to-day answer about what to do with Black people who are queer at HBCUs. And I really have not, I mean, to make them feel safe and to allow them to have that platform. And I really have not thought about that. But one of the things that I think would be great is for them to be in constant communication and friendly communication with people who are not queer on that campus, so that everybody is seeing one another whole and loving one another whole. How you make that happen is another question.
Fair, absolutely fair. One additional question for you.
Some would say that we're currently experiencing a renaissance in African American literature, similar to that of the early 20th century during the Harlem Renaissance. My question to you is, who from the Harlem Renaissance inspires you in your work?
I love Gwendolyn Bennett. I think she's a really good, underrated poet. And Lucille Clifton, I found out about her through the poet Lucille Clifton, because the Harlem Renaissance, like so many movements, turns out to be kind of a sexist movement. I mean, it's very easy for me, on the other hand, to name Countee Cullen and Langston Hughes and Claude McKay, who are my three favorite poets of that period. Four, if we count, along with Gwendolyn Bennett, who I found out about later in my life. Langston Hughes was an innovator of form through the blues. Countee Cullen too. What Countee Cullen was doing with sonnets is, I mean, nobody has ever said the word hate as many times as Countee Cullen has managed to say it in sonnets. And he also brings to us the Black immigrant experience. He's probably one of the first poets to ever bring to us the Black immigrant experience, and really talk very directly about what it is to live in America and love it and hate it all at once. And Countee Cullen's poems, you know, Yet Do I Marvel, is a beautiful poem. That's great. Yeah. So yeah, those three are really important to me. Can I say a thing about Renaissance? Because when you said Renaissance, I thought you were talking about the Renaissance, you know, back. I don't mind it. I appreciate it, and I know what is meant by it, and I know that it's positive. But I want to say, I'll say it. I just want to say that before Barack Obama became president of the United States, there were and had been Black people who were capable of becoming president of the United States in terms of their intellectual capability, in terms of their ability to be well liked, in terms of their ability to speak well in front of people. That existed for us. And there are moments in our history where people outside of our community and outside of our culture notice our writing and put it on what seems to be a bigger stage. But that doesn't mean that that writing hasn't been going on the entire time. That doesn't mean that I mean, I have a very powerful ancestry when it comes to folklore, when it comes to narrative thought, when it comes to the fact of how you tell a doggone story. And we've been doing that and perfecting that for hundreds of years in this country, all over the world, but just in this country. And so when I think about that, I just want to make sure everybody's clear, because tomorrow it won't be a renaissance. I guess everybody's going to stop reading Black people tomorrow. Do you know what I mean? Like, they gave this Pulitzer Prize, so it's coming to an end. They're like, wait a minute, whoever they is. So because of that, I think it's important for Black people to remember that we have literature among us, and it is our responsibility to grow, encourage us, and to grow and to encourage and to support that literature and the artists who make it. And for people who are lovers of Black literature, whether they be Black or white or any other color, that they have an understanding that that literature, even if you don't see it in the New York Times, is still going on, and it's still there for you to find. It's still there for you to look up. So
how do you, just teasing this out just a little bit more, you talked a little bit about legacy and heritage, and I want to hone in on accessibility, which is the difference between the heard word versus the written word. Often people have invisible stories, I should say. They have invisible stories that they may not have the faculty or the resource to transcribe it into written word. And so as you think about accessibility, because as you know, in order to be celebrated, you generally go through a fairly arduous education process. A lot of people may not have access to that. How does poetry account for the emotions for people who are unable to transcribe the heard word into the written word? And how do we make sure that those experiences are captured?
So this is a very difficult question. It's like 6 questions, right?
It's 17 questions.
There's a lot of questions.
Today is about compound questions.
I expect as much from you, and I appreciate it. I knew coming into this it wouldn't be easy. So, I
don't know how to take that.
It's a yes. It's an affirming statement. You are here to ask the difficult questions, right? There's so many vantage points from which to look at this question or to answer it. One has to do with what we think of as the mode by which we should be receiving our poetry or our art. And this idea that which you read is somehow better than that which you hear. Part of what I love about poetry, and part of the reason why I end up just being a person who can walk around knowing poems by heart, is that I have on the shuffle of all my music, I listen to all my music on the shuffle. And that means that I hear right after Yolanda Adams gospel, I hear, Atlanta trap music, right? And then right after that will come up anyone from Kevin Young going all the way back to Yeats reading a poem. And I think part of what I love about poems, what I love about poems is hearing them. And hearing poems, I think, is a value for me, at least. I mean, part of the reason why I never stop going to readings, and no matter how bad they are, when you go to a good one, it's worth all the bad ones you've seen. Because I believe, that's what I believe about what I'm doing. I feel about poetry the way I feel about music in that way. So I think there's value to that. I do think that when I read a poem, I get something different. And I do feel like in reading, I have an experience that is much more individual than it is communal. Than I hear when I hear it. Even when I'm by myself and I hear something, I feel more communal than I am when I'm by myself and I read something. And so so that's one thing. And then another thing has to do, yes, with access, the ability the ability to understand what the hell is going on in a poem, particularly when people are telling you, oh, this is, if you are a Black person without access to education, and then somebody tells you, here's the good Black stuff, and then you read the good Black stuff and you're like, I don't know what the hell this is about. Where am I supposed to intersect with this? Part of that has to do with the fact that we are attuned to things, we are educated in things without knowing we're being educated in them. So our appreciation for music happens because music's always on. And we have an appreciation for art, though we may not know it, because generally, particularly if you're in a city like New York where you live, generally you're walking around art all day, whether you notice it or not, right? And every once in a while, in all of your walking around, you do look up and you see, you see something and you're like, wait, who made that? What's that doing here? And you've actually walked by 20 other pieces of art, but you have a particular taste. And that's why you've noticed this one, And so I really think that if you don't have the access, starting at the beginning might feel different, but I think you have to start at the beginning. And I think the poem that is for you to be read is for you, but you would have to be in the situation of reading poems. So when I was saying earlier in this answer 20 years ago, when I was saying I listen to this music, the music I'm listening, when I'm washing dishes, when I'm taking a shower, I'm listening to music, right? And in that music, here comes Nikki Giovanni, right?
Yep.
Here comes, I come up sometime. Here comes Jericho Brown, right? So, but that's because I'm living in a world where that can happen. Just like you're walking around, you can see art, you're living a life where you're always listening to music. And in order to gain an appreciation for poetry, whether it's heard or written, you would have to put yourself in a situation where you're around enough poetry to be able to say that it's okay that you don't like most of it. And poetry gets a really bad rap because somehow or another, people are under the impression that they're supposed to like all of it or none of it. But there's no other art that you feel that way about. I found A. Van Jordan's Rise, a book I love. Thinking about it makes me emotional. Thinking about Van makes me emotional. He's such a great guy. But I found that book because I was at a point in my life where I would go to the library, not the library, the bookstore. I would go to the bookstore and I would go to the poetry section. That means one shelf. I would go to the poetry section and I would start at A and I would open the first book. It's probably Akhmatova, right? So this is a bad example because I like Akhmatova. But I would open the book and I would read the first few lines of a poem. I wouldn't even finish it. And if I was bored, I was strong enough to put it down and go to the next book. And I would do that until I got to a letter. That day, I got to J before I got to a book I liked. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
Because when you're taking a shower and you're listening to music, you made the playlist and you don't hear all the music. It's in the background, but every once in a while, a song comes up while you're in the shower and suddenly your shower is a dance floor. Do you understand what I mean? And our relationship to poetry has to be similar to that. We have to be around, you would have to be around it enough to like the little bit of it you're gonna like. You and I imagine you like music. I don't know what you like.
I love music.
Do you love music?
Love music.
Yeah, music and burpees, sure. Anyway.
Music and burpees and yoga, yeah. From Aretha Franklin to Miles Davis to Soul Sisters.
Okay, so you like that, right?
Well, I like all types of music.
You like all types of
jazz, pop.
Oh, good.
Everything.
Like a lot of stuff. Wow. You could do anything. No matter how much music a music lover likes, they don't like most of the music.
Right.
If you have taste, and I believe every human being does, you're going to have your reasons for liking what you like, loving what you love. And that is going to be a small percentage of all of it. And that's okay. That's as it should be. And there should be more poetry in the world so that it is speaking to more people. To answer that question about I mean, I guess that
after
answers.
those experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other thing that happens in poems, and y'all just have to, if this answer is too long, y'all have to edit this. I'm not sure who did it, but somebody just is out here lying about poetry and what you're supposed to do when you read it. Somebody asked me in an interview, maybe yesterday or the day before, how do you read a poem? And my answer was left to right, top to bottom, the way you read everything else. And the reason why that question comes up is because somebody's under the impression when they read a poem, they're supposed to stop and decode every line. So that's an awful reading experience. You're reading a line, you're like, okay, now I got to figure out what that means before I read the next line. That's embarrassing. No poet wants you to do that. So y'all are welcome to stop. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, because you get robbed of the experience by doing that.
Yeah. Somebody told many of us, I don't know who that liar was, told many of us that poems are to be read in this way where you're looking for a hidden meaning in every other word, that it's somehow some sort of secret code. And while I understand that deeper reading and more readings of a single poem leads to more resonance and more understanding of that poem, I think every poem of every poet of every poet would rather you experience a poem than try to decode it. My love for Anita Baker has nothing to do with understanding a word she's saying when she's singing a song, that's for sure. And if you were to ask me to sing my favorite Anita Baker song, I'll start singing it, but I bet you it's my favorite song and I don't really know the words because I don't know what she's saying. You understand what I'm saying? That makes sense?
It does make sense.
It's okay in a poem to be a little like, I don't know what's going on right here, but let me keep going. That happens to you when you're reading an email. So what, you know what I mean? So that's what I have to say about the reading of poetry.
Well, it's about instinct, it's about intuition, it's about the rhythms.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you, Jericho Brown, for sharing time with us. Thank you for sharing your works of art with us. Thank you for challenging us to think beyond our personal experiences and redefine them through new eyes. Thank you for forcing us to constantly think about the other and find ourselves in the other. We appreciate your work. We appreciate your support of the community and the communities that are marginalized. And we thank you for joining us tonight and for continuing to do the work that you do.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.